So the title of the book that we're talking about today that you've written with U of T Press is Youth and Subculture as Creative Force, Creating New Spaces for Radical Youth Work. And yeah, for people that aren't particularly familiar with that, what does that really mean?
Well, you've got a lot in there, don't you? It's a combination of this notion that youth compromises or composes an alternate sort of space within the social as a liminal space between childhood and adulthood that's inherently both inside and outside the culture. The first category is young people or youth, adolescents. And one of the central premises of the book is that the way that we have socially constructed this category, it has a particular kind of alterity that has political implications and possibilities, the largest of which is that because it's positioned between childhood and adulthood, it has the capacity to both draw from and undo both of those social categories in interesting sorts of ways. So the first category is youth. Now, and subcultures, of course, subcultures are subaltern sort of social configurations of various types. And the term at the time when I wrote the book was a bit more comfortable for me than it is now. I'm not sure that I really like the term any longer, but we'll go with it for the moment. So subcultures in this particular instance would be cultures that exist on the margins of the dominant social. The category of sub is a bit problematic in the same way that subconscious is problematic, in the sense that it's not actually beneath necessarily, as sub would imply, although it runs under the surface to some degree of the dominant social. So in that sense, one might talk about it that way. But it comprises an alternative configuration that oftentimes presages shifts and changes in society. And so one of the notions is that this comprises certain sorts of creative forces that are premised in social configurations that aren't yet. They're very specifically things that are on the way and that are presaged by the way that groups, particularly those groups that operate towards the edges of the margins of the social, configure themselves in what Deleuze and Guattari would talk about as minoritarian, that is to say, as constitutively put together in such a way as to not be able to belong, not because they choose to absent themselves. It's not a voluntary sort of, okay, we're just not going to belong to the dominant society, we're going to drop out, so much as there's a hardcore center to that has to do with groups of people who simply cannot belong. They're constitutively incapable of belonging. That constitutive incapacity results in the possibility of building social forms that aren't in existence yet, and that because they're not in existence yet, posit a capacity for challenging the dominant social. So youth as subcultures as creative force is specifically that sort of configuration. Now, the part that comes after the colon has something to do with the sort of notion that there's a false dichotomy between youth and adults that gets configured within the relationship of people who encounter young people within their work life as folks who are to be engaged in terms of being helpful to them. And so youth work has this sort of edge to it. Now, the most interesting aspects of youth work, though, are not the aspects in which youth workers are operating on behalf of the dominant social in order to be of assistance to young people, but those places in which youth and adults are thrown together in those situations and find commonalities of purpose. And we've talked about that in our writing. By our, I mean several authors, most notably my partner Kathy Skott-Myhre and myself, have written about that as radical youth work. And radical youth work we've defined as youth and adults coming together for common purpose. So the second half of it is, if we were to pay attention to the ways that youth subcultures, and in the case of the book, it was punks and skinheads, and we can say more about that later, the ways that those subcultures offer to adults who are interested in working with youth towards common purposes, that if we take seriously paying attention to youth subcultures, not as phenomenon of adolescence, but as phenomenon of social alterity, and if we take that in terms of political configuration that allows for young people and adults to work together towards common purpose. And by common purpose, I mean those struggles that we all face in terms of the actual material conditions of our historical moment. If we take all of that seriously, then youth work becomes a different sort of endeavor. And so that's sort of how that title breaks down for me.
That's a mouthful.
It's a little bit. Yeah.
But it's interesting because as you've just started to elaborate, these are on the surface, these words at least are very simple and very common, I think, at least most of them, right? Youth, creativity, subculture, force, all of these elements are somewhat simple building blocks. The more closely you look at them and ask how they align, the more complex they become, these arrangements. And that's, I think, one of the most interesting parts about your work in this book in particular. Let's maybe talk about a few of the terms that you have used. Youth, for example, is how you begin this discussion, and yet, if I understand correctly, on some level you don't think it exists, or it doesn't exist as a clear, fixed category. And I was wondering if you could say more about how you envision just what youth is, especially since it may or may not exist.
Okay, so let's play with this notion of existence for a moment. Of course, if we take the sort of notion that Spinoza proposes in the Ethics, that we live in a world of what he would call superstitions, which are social conventions of description. And social conventions of descriptions are actually reasonably inaccurate, or what he would call inadequate. And they're inadequate to the degree that they are incapable of describing the actual sets of relations, the actual sets of material relations that compose the world, right? So if that's the case, then we have lots and lots of social configurations, lots and lots of social descriptions, including things like youth, women, race, et cetera, and so forth, that are socially configured within particular historical periods for certain purposes, particularly those purposes of groups of people who wish to advance certain sorts of projects. So youth in particular is one of these social configurations, one of the ways that we describe groups of people. And of course, we don't really get it. I mean, we don't really get adolescence until the early part of the 20th century. I mean, Stanley Hall invents the category of adolescence in the very early 1900s, prior to 1910, in fact. And then it sort of takes off, and as these things do, these terms have a tendency to proliferate. This is sort of Niklas Luhmann's great insight about how social categories proliferate within societies that are built heavily on social code. And of course, capitalism is a system that's heavily encoded. And so as we live within a capitalist system of heavy coding, then our social configurations of heavy code have a tendency to have an autopoietic sort of capacity to proliferate themselves. And so youth, adolescence as a category that initially starts reasonably narrow. It's usually defined by pubescence and then sort of ends at the point that one gets married and joins the workforce. Over the last 100 years or so has proliferated into all kinds of different configurations. We have preteens. We have adolescents now. We have the adolescent themselves. The age range now extends from somewhere as early as 8 all the way up to as late as 30. And so the social category of youth becomes highly, highly malleable and proliferates quite madly across the globe. I mean, almost every society now has this notion of adolescence or youth, which really starts in the United States. That said, just because it doesn't exist and just because it's simply a proliferation of certain kinds of social categories doesn't mean that it doesn't have dramatic effects. To the degree that we believe that there are youth, that we believe that there are adolescents, that we use a good deal of science and a good deal of sociology and a good deal of social sciences to try to advance the idea that this category actually has some sort of material grounding. And to the degree we use our media and our family structures and our educational structures to advance the idea that this category has some degree of reality, to that degree, of course, those subjects that are categorized as youth begin to interject that sort of a notion into themselves and start to believe that, in fact, they are adolescents, and they take this on as an identity, and they take on the configurations of that identity, notions of rebelliousness and so forth and so on. And adults, of course, also come to believe things about youth. I mean, you can see this in the current discourse about millennials, They have all of these attributes now that are in the media, that are among adult discourse, that categorize them as having certain sorts of behaviors, being sort of narcissistic, self-involved, a bit lazy possibly, et cetera, and so forth. And then you have a counter discourse that says, no, they're really quite lovely and revolutionary and et cetera, and so forth. So you have these sort of counter discourses that people that aren't simply abstractions. I mean, people take these things in and they begin to live them as though they were actual, and because they live them as though they are actual, they actually produce social configurations that have some degree of material reality in the sense that they are acted as though they were so, right? Now, one of the difficulties with that, I mean, there's of course lots and lots of difficulties with that, but one of the difficulties with that is that one of the things that it does is drive a line between young people and adults. And certainly there's some historical reason to think that adolescence was initially designed to some degree within industrial capitalism to keep certain groups of people out of the job market so that older people could have the jobs before those folks who were married and were going to have children, our typical sort of heterotopic societies, right? And so we have this sort of idea that the people who are pre-marriage, pre-children should not necessarily get the jobs. And so we developed this category of adolescents to sort of say, well, they're not quite ready. They're developmentally incapable. And so we'll keep them out of the job market and put them in school. And school is then related to their developmental category and developmental capacities. So this initial scission between young people and adults surrounding employment begins to break down pretty significantly in terms of the interests that adults and young people have in common over the last 50 years, in the respect that, as it stands now, a 15-year-old and a 4-year-old do not have that much difference in terms of the way that they're encountering the social. Their capacity to work, their capacity to get housing, their capacity to provide, all of these things now adults and young people have more and more and more in common. And so the category of adolescence is almost a politically necessary category if one wants to make sure that you can divide and conquer groups of people so they do not understand how much they have in common. And so in this sense, youth becomes a distraction from being able to adults and young people to find things in common. And to give you a very, very concrete example of this, youth workers who get paid extremely little are oftentimes working with adolescents who actually make more working in their fast food restaurants than youth workers make working for the agency. And yet the youth worker is supposed to be teaching job skills to the adolescent who is actually making more money than they are, may have better benefits than they do. And both of them have quite a lot in common in terms of being on the lowest rung of the economic ladder in terms of benefits and wages, ability to organize, ability to unionize. All of these things they share in common. And yet, because of the division between the adults in the agency and the young people in the agency, those conversations simply don't happen. Young people and adults in the agency are not talking about, hey, what do we have economically in common here? What do we have in terms of the ways we're getting screwed? How might we organize politically within this agency so that we can take control of it? The most concrete example I can give you of that is that a number of years ago, I gave a talk in Scotland, and this was just prior to what eventually happened, which was the complete downsizing of youth work in Great Britain, in which tons and tons of agencies and tons of programs over the last 10 years have been decimated. The money's been withdrawn from them. They've been shut down left, right, and center. 10 years ago when I gave this talk, or 8 years ago, it was pretty clear that was going to happen. And I was saying to the youth workers that I was speaking with, I said, so if we really want to talk about what young people and adults hold in common and whether or not youth workers actually have political investment and stake in the young people that they claim they work with, then the real truth of that is when the rubber meets the road, when they come to shut down your group home. And do you at that point say, no, we're going to squat the house with the kids because this is their house, this is our house, we work together in this house, we're going to take this house? Or do you simply say, well, gee, that's too bad. Sorry, kids, I'm going to go get another job so that I can keep my paycheck coming. And it's specifically this division between youth and adults as radically separate entities, as having completely different sets of interests, this sort of pseudo division that keeps that sort of political action from happening.
That's something that I know you and I have talked about before, and I'm wondering how you would respond to somebody who sees what you've just said, sort of as a conspiracy because especially it seems unlikely or unreasonable that someone's controlling this, right? Like that the president sees this as the target, as the strategy in which he can operate, or as Congress people, or as educators perhaps, or any people with power don't seem to actively be setting up this division. And so how do we understand this power dynamic without a head or without a leader?
Well, I think first of all, I have to argue with you slightly, although I agree with the main point. But in the terms of the particulars, leaders do this all the time. They're constantly demonizing young people. You know, this recent appointment of Betsy DeVos to be the Secretary of Education for the United States. You know, her entire rhetoric is talking about kids as a disadvantaged category, talking about adults being able to have choice about where they put kids in schools. The entire discourse that she's engaged in gives a considerable amount of power to adults and very, very little consideration of young people or what young people might have in common with adults in terms of the necessities of education in the 21st century. There's almost no discourse there. But the discourse from her as an adult, as one of the leaders in the discourse, I would argue, with the president, discourse the prime minister, I mean, you go around the world, the discourse about young people continues to place them in a subaltern status. And it's quite articulate and quite persistent and quite consistent. The question is that intentional? Are people meeting in back rooms and saying, let's screw the kids? No, I don't think so. I mean, perhaps that's the case, but I rather doubt it. However, this begs a significant political question for me, which is that people misunderstand, or I think many people misunderstand, the idea that there are logics within any given social, that systems such as capitalism, for example, is less a conspiracy than it is a certain kind of logic. In other words, if you set up a society, that society is going to have a sort of mechanistic logic to it, in which certain things are allowed and certain things are prohibited and certain things are believed and certain things are doubted. And it's a logic. And yes, the logic is spread by people without a doubt, but the logic is much larger than any leader. The logic is much larger than any given person. The logic is an endemic logic. I mean, this is one of Foucault's central points in terms of the way he talks about certain kinds of apparatuses spreading across society, certain sorts of discourses evolving that seems to exceed at a certain point the capacity of that logic to meet the needs of the people who are actually disseminating it. And so at a certain point, you have this odd disjunct at which the logic is being disseminated by large numbers of people. And of course, this evidences itself in the leaders that people are willing to put up with. So they tend to have a certain force of their own. But it also, at a certain point, exceeds the capacity of the to serve the needs of the population that are actually disseminating the logic. And you get this odd set of contradictions, what Marx would call contradictions and antagonisms, in which the contradictions of the prevailing social logic no longer meet the material needs of the people who are disseminating the logic. And when that happens, then you have a system in crisis. And what generally happens at that point is there's even a greater force to the discourse. The discourse becomes more frantic. It becomes disseminated even more widely, more forcefully, more adamantly, more polemically. And you begin to get a system. So, adolescence is one of these things. We're deploying psychology and psychiatry and neurobiology and education. And we have all of these discourses all running quite strongly to tell us who young people are and what young people are capable of and what they can do and what they can't do. And millennials and Generation X's. We have all of these discourses, all of which are trying to say in one way or another, look, it's not the system that's gone wrong. These young people are simply not up to the task. There's something essentially fundamentally screwed up about these folks, these adolescents. So as a result of which, the fact that they're doing not particularly feeling comfortable with society and still having to live with their parents and still having low-wage jobs, et cetera, and so forth. Well, they have frontal lobe development issues in which they can't make good moral choices, and they have certain sorts of developmental delays based on hovering parents and helicopter parents, and they have schools didn't train them properly to work hard. So you have all of these discourses that sort of say, well, it's everything but the prevailing discourse. On the other hand, have this sort of what I would call subcultural discourses but I did in the book call them this, that sort of give this idea that young people are in fact understanding this contradiction in a phenomenological way. They're the living contradiction. And as the living contradiction, they develop an antagonism with the dominant system, particularly as it evolves. So let's say that, to use these terms that are so popular, so Generation X, let's say, born into a world in transition between industrial capitalism and for lack of a better term, global capitalism, virtual capitalism, i.e. computers and the internet. Let's say that Generation X was born into that world, and that world became a bit dystopic for them. Their reaction, because it was a transitional period, is to think to themselves, well, gosh, I feel sort of nostalgic for the world in which you could have a job and insurance and things went rather well, and as a result of which you begin to get some sort of nihilistic sorts of turns within Generation X and some sort of sense of despair and depression, endemic bipolar disorder, et cetera, and so forth. The millennials didn't get born into a society in transition. They got born into a society as is. And so they get born into the world as it is, a pure global capitalism. As a result of which the contradiction is not between eras. Their contradiction is within the system as it stands. And the contradiction within the system as it stands builds a different level of antagonism to a generation that's born between systems. And so the generation that's born within the system becomes what Margaret Mead would be called a pregenerative generation. And Margaret Mead used to say a pregenerative, and she had this idea back in the 40s and 50s, a pregenerative generation is a generation that understands the world as it is better than their parents do because they are born into the world that their parents only brought into being. And that set of antagonisms and contradictions as a social logic means that, no, not that there are people sitting in back rooms. The system has gone well beyond most people's capacity to apprehend it. We are now fully cyborg at this point. I mean, we are utterly embedded within, as Marx said in the Grundrisse, a global network of machinery in which we're embedded as transitional nodes of consciousness. So the system to some degree is runaway escalatory system, as Gregory Bateson would have it, in which we're a bit along for the ride. But on the other hand, so in that sense, no one's sitting probably in back rooms trying to hatch a nefarious plot to show that kids are lazy or bad. But the logic sets up sort of certain sorts of diversity, certain sorts of contradictions, certain sorts of ways of engaging with one another that build linguistic forms that are inherently entangled and intersected so in ways that allow for certain kinds of conversations to arise. This gets back to the idea that, of course, we're born into a world of language. We don't make up the language whole cloth. The language that we're born into has a certain logic to it. The way that the words are put together, the way that words evolve, the way that language evolves, we're born into that world. And that world of language into which we're born has sort of prefigured patterns to it. And so as we try to explain the world using that language, it either fails or succeeds to actually make sense of the world for us as we experience it. And in that, the definitions of youth over the last 15, 20 years are now almost frantically proliferating in order to try to keep up with the contradictions and antagonisms of what's actually happening with young people, which is almost inarticulable now.
Well, before I ask my actual question, I want to ask you if you would consider yourself a youth worker or not. As a professor, I mean, you're a professor, you're a human being who interacts with youth, but would you call yourself a youth worker, or what is a youth worker?
Yeah, well, I teach this all the time, so I teach youth workers, right? So my definition of a youth worker is anyone who has any sort of interaction with a young person.
So by that definition, you are a youth worker?
We all are.
Okay.
It's a question as to how well we do it, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, and that's really my next question, is that you are, to some extent, a youth worker. You're training people in your university courses who want to go into a professionalized form of youth work in many cases. And you're talking about radical youth work and I guess the difference, among other things, between what is happening in youth work and perhaps what ought to be happening in youth work. And I was just wondering if you can explain what youth work really is beyond the simple interaction, and what it is and what it should be, if there's a difference.
Chiara Scarabaggi has written brilliantly about the difference between practice and purpose in youth work, and specifically this way, that, what we intend is the purpose of youth work, which is to have premised, at least among most scholars who write in the area and most people who are sort of held up to the field as being folks who know what's going on. The purpose of youth work is to establish a relational set of capacities with young people so that you build a relationship, and through that relationship, both of you find phenomenological interactions and exchanges and encounters that allow for you to expend the maximum degree of your creative possibilities for both the youth worker and the young person. But that, of course, gets mediated through all sorts of institutions that have different agendas, all sorts of disciplines that are intersect with youth work that have different sorts of ideas, diagnosis, neurobiological constructs, disciplinary constructs, et cetera, so forth. So you have this entanglement of those things. That said, I think one of the reasons that I continue to be interested in youth work is that it does, at its essence, in the best of it, has to do with relational encounter. And unlike other forms of assistance to people, it eschews this sort of notion that you would sit down and interview a young person, or that you would try to find a diagnosis for them. You would meet them in your office and they would come to see you, and you would meet with them and sit with them and talk with them. No, you would, in youth work, you cook with them, and you play basketball with them, and you go for a walk with them, and you play some games with them. During that period of time, you talk about things and you do things together, and you work within what's called life space. And in that, there's a phenomenological encounter of mutual intersecting of bodies and minds, et cetera, and so forth. Now, why do I think that that's politically interesting? I think it's politically interesting because we live in a highly abstract codified system. Capitalism operates as abstract code. And what it does is to abstract us from our lived encounters, our lived experiences of one another. And I think that as a result of which, if youth work has a possibility, it is specifically in the respect that it calls for lived material encounter. And lived material encounter at the profoundly local level may be the way in which we stand some possibility of building alternative systems of value that might challenge the prevailing global dominant capitalist logic.
If that's the case, and if that, I don't necessarily think, and I'm sure you'd agree, that not everybody sees it in that way, but the people particularly either invested in it or invested in bringing it down and defunding it, or in not supporting it on a local political level or a national level or international level, it seems very easy, or it seems very simple, I should say, that working with youth to improve the way that they are able to operate in society would be beneficial in many ways. But I suppose if in working with them they create trouble, if you want to call it that, for the current system, then you could also see how people who are benefiting most and who are effectively in charge in many positions of the current system would be against youth work. And so it's an interesting and precarious situation. How do you negotiate that on a more practical level in terms of these systems, or in these political systems, when they want to defund, when they say effectively that it's not worth the money that we're giving, and therefore we're going to defund it and put it into this or that, and they get votes for doing that. So that's one issue, right? And another issue, I suppose, is that if it is working, then effectively it could undermine them. And so for their own benefit, if not for some economic or for some financial reason, for their own benefit, they don't want to see themselves overthrown, they wouldn't fund it. And so it seems very hard to convince more and more politicians and voters that this is an important thing to fund. How do you negotiate that?
Well, there are two levels here. And let's be clear, I don't think that in any meaningful way the existing systems of governance are the least bit responsive to the material actualities of what people are experiencing, and nor do I think they can be. They're not particularly useful in that respect. That said, does that mean that one shouldn't try to turn them towards gentler, kinder ways of being, so that people suffer a little bit less? Well, sure. Of course you should try to, if at all possible, get a kid some clean drinking water, maybe a chance to have some education, medical care, et cetera, and so forth. Of course you should try to do that. However, one should recognize that that's a failing rearguard action. That's not going to sustain over time. That system is collapsing. We're in the midst of a collapsing empire, and collapsing empires are brutal places. So training young people to exist within the system is consigning them to brutality and the acceptance of certain levels of brutality within their day-to-day lived experience that I don't think is reasonable. And to that degree, youth work as an extension of liberal democratic governance is probably finished. I think that's probably done. I mean, it'll carry on for a bit longer, of course. And to the degree that people in those institutions can turn them in such a way as to make life better for kids in terms of making it a little less tough, I think that's great. But I think putting a whole lot of energy in continuing to try to keep that happening is probably a fool's errand. I think that's largely done. I think that's finished. And if that's the case, then I think that probably some of the more underground movements that are happening in terms of things like Freedom University that works with illegal immigrant kids under the radar outside of government funding, programs that operate outside of any funding circle to work with kids in interesting sorts of ways. In Detroit, for example, Grace Lee Boggs' work, some of the other sorts of things that are going on with kids to do organic gardening and to do rebuilding their neighborhoods and to configure new forms of value within social stuff. I think that's the cutting edge, what I call do-it-yourself youth work, which I think is the new youth work, the coming youth work. Because the existing system doesn't function for kids. You know, we have a system in which somehow it seems reasonable to have a discussion about climate change when ocean levels are rising and covering islands and people are going to starve. Millions of people are going to starve to death in the next 10 years in Africa. This was on the news this morning. That kids are getting rampant diseases that are being trafficked through globalization, and viruses and diseases are showing up all over the globe. Kids are being murdered and blown up. I mean, the conditions for young people are increasingly bad. And yet we think because we have this sort of Habermasian notion of voice, that we can have reasoned discussions about this, that there's some point of debate that can be had in which we say, well, now maybe we should be more reasonable about this and think about whether or not climate really exists, or whether capitalism are good or bad, or whether a living wage is a thing that we should. This is absurd. And to have these sorts of discussions in the face of what's happening to young people, it would seem to me that if I was a young person, I would have no truck with it at all. It's not to my advantage to be involved in the system in any meaningful sort of way. Why in the world would I do that?
Well, I guess, yeah, and that we are seeing more and more, or less and less, I should say, involvement in mainstream politics in a lot of cases with a lot of youth. Depending on how you define that, of course, but I know that voter turnout is an issue and these kinds of things. And I guess what is an alternative way of becoming or working with each other? You said that you've moved away recently from the idea of a subculture or a subaltern, perhaps. Could you maybe say a little bit more about why that is, what led you to that, and then what kind of collective association you foresee as being beneficial to youth?
Well, it's not just youth, is it? Because that's the thing. These sort of categorizations, taxonomical categorizations between people, subcultures versus alternative cultures, authentic cultures, youth, adults, et cetera, and so forth. They have some degree of viability to the degree that they produce forms of alterity that allow for the production of alternate systems of value. But they have to be taken as tactics. We have to understand them tactically, not as actualities. To the degree that they function tactically, they're useful, but that's going to be for a fairly short period of time in most instances because of the speed and the way that things are evolving. And so I think we have to think about these as sort of social tactics, political tactics, rather than identities or social configurations of any duration. And so as a result of that, I think we have to rethink the fact that young people and adults should be operating politically as distinct categories. We have to collapse those categories. And we have to understand we have way more in common than we have in difference. And as a result of that, we have political possibilities. Now, that said, without a doubt, we have to work in many, many, many different levels. I think there's no binary configuration that says one should not work with democratic government forms. No, of course you should. Or to say one shouldn't vote. Sure, go ahead. To say one should only be involved in the most extreme demonstrations. Well, that's a bit silly as well. Or one should only live off the grid. Well, I think you should do any and all of those things. Not one or two of them, all of them. Do all of them. And to the degree that they meet the tactical needs of the moment, do them. Don't attempt to be a purist in any sort of way in terms of your political action. Your political action should be multifaceted, and it should be mobile, and it should involve an infinitude of tactics, because capitalism, if nothing else, is extremely good at appropriating anything you create. And so you're going to need to keep moving. You're going to need to keep mobile, and you're going to need to be creative. And so if that's the case, then what are we looking for? Well, we're looking for what we have called in some of our writing political love, and we borrow this term from Parda Negri. We've sort of thought about it a bit ourselves. And that, in that sense, political love is the configuration of living force that allows for the maximum creative expression of that force at any given moment, any given point in time. And that's the politics that I'm working towards, is that sort of politics.
And then why, or what is the issue, I suppose, with subculture and subaltern that makes you move away from that?
Well, only the sense that it sort of gives a certain sense that there's these small little pockets and groups. And I think at a particular moment in history that was the case, that we had sort of these pockets and groups, particularly within Western society, that were functioning as alternate systems of value sort of under the surface of the dominant society. I think that's all spread now. It goes back to what I was saying before, which is that I think as we enter the 21st century, we are now the system, the antagonisms and the contradictions that may have been operating under the surface in ways that may have only been available to a few folks are now endemic.
I guess one of the things that I want to ask you from trying to come up with a different point of view is that I know that you are, obviously very well read in terms of theory, and that you refer to a number of theorists ranging a whole span of different approaches and fields of thought. It can get, I'm sure it can get overwhelming, particularly to those without the kind of training you've had, and particularly to the younger people that you're dealing with. At the same time, I know that theory can open doors. Reading and learning theory can, at the very least, give you new frameworks of thinking about the world around you, right? And so, it's a wonderful thing, but it's also an intimidating thing. And I know you and I have talked about that before. My question is, what, if any, would you recommend in terms of maybe a book or a theorist for somebody who's just starting to think about these things and get into it? Is there anybody in particular that you would say is a great starting point for someone who is interested and yet potentially intimidated by theory when it comes to these issues?
Karl Marx.
And what would you say to the people who have been trained or who have been told that that's sort of a bad word?
Well, then they should be involved in that sort of perversion.
What makes him the starting point for you?
I think he's clear. He's accessible. I think that he has a lot to say. I think he was extremely prescient. There's lots of problems with Marx, don't get me wrong, and you have to go beyond your initial entry point, right? But if you're asking me for an entry point, that would be the entry point. If you wanted an even more gentle entry point that is Marx, but without the Marx, Paulo Freire is a good entry point, I think.
Mm-hmm. And what do those thinkers give you in terms of maybe strategies or tactics or just worldviews? What would you say that? Obviously, they've written a lot, and so it's hard to choose one or two things. But if you could say that Marx's gift to you as a reader, at the very least, would be this, what would it be?
Okay, so I think in both cases, and I think this is true of almost anyone you're going to read, and that is that if you're going to take, and I'm assuming that I'm going to address this to people who are not particularly comfortable with the system as it stands. If you're comfortable with the system as it stands, you probably shouldn't bother talking to me. But if you're uncomfortable with the system as it stands, then you should understand it. you should understand how it functions. You should understand how it works, what it does. And I think Marx is probably the greatest theorist in terms of understanding how capitalism works. And so I think if you want to understand how we work as human beings within social systems, then I would direct you to Spinoza, but he's a bit more difficult. So I think Marx and Spinoza are the two. And then if you want to add a third, it would be probably one of the psychoanalysts. But to start with Marx, then you understand how the machinery works. If you don't understand how the system functions, it's quite difficult to do anything about it. You're going to continue to pick tactics that are not responsive to the way the system functions. And I think Marx is the great theorist of this. And once you've got the basics of Marx down, that opens up a whole world of Marxists and post-Marxists that continue that project of trying to understand how the system evolved and what its new forms are and how the new forms work.
Well, that is a lot to think about, and I really wish we could talk more because I know we could go on almost forever. But I want to just say I really appreciate you coming in today. Is there anything else you wanted to say before it's over?
No, thanks. It's lovely. It's nice to try to articulate some of that.
Well, again, that's Hans Skott-Myhre, author of Youth and Subculture's Creative Force, Creating New Spaces for Radical Youth Work, and the author of many other great works that I recommend anybody check out who's interested in these topics.